In the gentle embrace of springtime, as soft breezes whispered through the awakening valleys of France, a tale of remarkable transformation began to unfold, forever altering the course of European history. The year was 1796, a time when France, like a delicate flower pushing through winter frost, was embarking on a new journey. It was during these uncertain times that a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte received an extraordinary opportunity. Imagine, if you will, the tranquil Italian countryside, where rolling hills meet ancient stone walls, and morning mists cloak the promises of tomorrow. Into this serene setting stepped our protagonist, his heart filled with dreams as vast as the Mediterranean sky. The army of Italy, entrusted to his care, was like a garden long neglected, weary soldiers, meager supplies, and a spirit yearning for renewal. Napoleon, however, saw a beauty in this imperfect canvas. Like a master artist with an empty palette, he began to paint his masterpiece with strokes of brilliant strategy and gentle determination. His methods were akin to a soothing lullaby in the chaos of war, swift yet graceful, bold yet measured, each movement flowing into the next like verses in a peaceful poem. Through the quiet valleys and over the sleeping mountains, he guided his men with the patience of a shepherd leading his flock. The Austrians and Sardinians, comfortable in their traditional ways, like children wrapped in familiar blankets, never imagined that this young dreamer would reshape their world with such elegant precision. As moonlight bathed the Italian plains in silver, Napoleon's vision unfolded like a bedtime story written in the stars. Each chapter brought new wonders, each victory adding another golden thread to the tapestry of his legacy. His army moved like dancers in a grand ballet, their coordinated movements telling a tale of transformation that would echo through the corridors of time. And so, dear listeners, as we settle into this tale of destiny and dreams, let us journey together through the gentle revolution that began in those spring days of 1796. For in this story, we shall discover how one soul's quiet determination could awaken a sleeping continent to possibilities it had never dared to imagine. Picture this: Northern Italy, 1796, where diamond-bright stars pierce the twilight sky, and ancient stone walls whisper secrets of empires past. Into this enchanting landscape steps a figure whose very presence seems to electrify the air. Napoleon Bonaparte, the brilliant young Corsican general with eyes that sparkled with untold possibilities. His army might have appeared threadbare, their uniforms faded like autumn leaves, but in Napoleon's masterful hands, even this ragged force would soon shine like polished bronze. Every soldier, every strategic decision became a testament to his unparalleled vision. Napoleon's leadership was a beacon of hope, illuminating the path forward and transforming a weary army into a formidable force capable of altering the course of history. As we reflect on this extraordinary journey, we are reminded of the power of vision and determination. Napoleon's story is a testament to the potential within us, all to rise above challenges and create a legacy that inspires generations. In 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, was at the height of his power, basking in the glory of his victory over Austria at Wagram. His triumph allowed him to impose a punishing peace, stretching his empire even further. However, his decision to invade Spain and Portugal the previous year was starting to backfire, sparking a fierce conflict that threatened to engulf his empire. The Iberian Peninsula became a defiant and bloody arena of resistance, The Spanish uprising was fueled by Napoleon's controversial choice to place his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The rebellion spread like wildfire, and the French responded with unyielding force. In February 1809, Marshal Lannes captured Zaragoza after a grueling siege, which resulted in the loss of 54,000 Spanish lives and 10,000 French soldiers. Despite this devastation, the indomitable spirit of the Iberians refused to be extinguished. Just 3 months after the British retreated from Corunna, a new challenge emerged. Sir Arthur Wellesley, who arrived in Lisbon to lead an Anglo-Portuguese army. Under British guidance, the Portuguese troops quickly transformed into a formidable force. Within weeks, Wellesley launched a surprise attack on Marshal Soult's Second Corps in Porto, catching the French off guard during their plundering. Soult's troops, stunned and disorganized, fled back into Spain, temporarily securing Portugal. With Portugal reclaimed, Wellesley aimed to push into Spain alongside General Cuesta's army of Extremadura. However, their alliance was marred by mistrust. Centuries of conflict had bred deep suspicion. The Spanish were wary of British intentions, while the British were skeptical of Spanish leadership. Wellesley's request to command both forces was denied, resulting in a fragile cooperation. Nevertheless, on July 10th, the two generals met at Casas de Miravete and agreed to advance together up the Tagus Valley toward Madrid, supported by General Venegas from La Mancha. This joint offensive, fraught with discord and danger, became the focal point of Napoleon's Peninsular War. It was a campaign where conquest flirted with catastrophe. Alliances were tested and empires strained. It was a stage set for both triumph and tragedy. The Peninsular War became a saga of courage, chaos, and more political backstabbing than a Love Island reunion. Let's dive in. Marshal Victor's retreat to Talavera, pure French theatrics. King Joseph and General Sebastiani arrived, full of bravado, only to face Britain's Iron Duke, Wellington. The French attack, a disaster. British infantry, with their legendary discipline, repelled wave after wave of French assaults as if it were just another day at the office. Talavera was a tactical win, but strategically meaningless. Why? Because Soult's sneaky northern advance forced Wellington to retreat from his own victory. Oh, the irony. Meanwhile, the Supreme Junta in Seville, bless their hearts, attempted to raise 2 new armies to liberate Madrid. Their plan? Converge from north and south. Spoiler, it went full Game of Thrones. Winter's first frost found Massena's army unraveling. Reluctant boots carved paths northward, away from Lisbon's whispered taunts. Wellington's scouts followed, their breaths hanging in the air as they traced the French trail, a mosaic of splintered doors and cold hearths, of lives extinguished not by battle, but by the slow, suffocating grip of war. The land sighed in their wake. Snow settled over scorched fields, blurring the scars. Somewhere, a peasant's prayer lingered, a fragile note in the wind, waiting for spring. The aftermath of Massena's retreat from Portugal unfolded as a series of dramatic confrontations and strategic maneuvers. Marshal Ney, commanding the French rearguard with his characteristic brilliance, fought a series of delaying actions that allowed the main army to withdraw in relative safety. However, tension between the French commanders reached a breaking point when Ney openly criticized Massena's leadership. The dear child of victory, as Napoleon had once fondly nicknamed Massena, responded by dismissing his subordinate, a decision that would further erode his already diminishing authority. Wellington, seizing the initiative after driving the French from Portugal, moved to capture the strategic fortress of Almeida. This prompted Massena, who had used the respite to rest and reinforce his army, to launch a counter-offensive to save the garrison. The armies clashed at Fuentes de Oñoro in a brutal 2-day battle that exemplified the war's intensity. Despite repeated attacks, Massena's forces could not break through Wellington's carefully chosen defensive positions. The British commander's tactical acumen had once again proved decisive. The fall of Almeida the following week should have marked a complete British triumph. However, the victory was tainted when poor coordination among British units allowed most of the French garrison to slip away under cover of darkness, prompting a furious reaction from Wellington. This episode highlighted how even minor oversights could compromise major strategic gains. For Massena, these setbacks proved catastrophic. The campaign in Portugal had cost him 25,000 irreplaceable veterans, and now Almeida was lost as well. His reputation suffered further damage from a series of questionable decisions, most notably bringing his mistress on campaign, an indulgence that scandalized his officers and undermined their respect. Napoleon, who had once favored Massena above all his marshals, recalled him to France in disgrace. The marshal who had won so many victories would never again command a major force. Marshal Marmont, younger and untested in the peninsula, arrived to take his place. Meanwhile, the war's focus shifted to another crucial fortress, Badajoz. Marshal Beresford, commanding a combined force of 20,000 British and Portuguese troops, moved to besiege it. When Marshal Soult approached with a relief force, Beresford made the bold decision to meet him in open battle at Albuera. What followed was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war. Both sides suffered approximately 6,000 casualties, with the British infantry bearing a particularly devastating toll, more than a third of their number killed, wounded, or captured. The battle produced one of the war's most famous quotes, as Soult grudgingly acknowledged the extraordinary resilience of the British soldiers. "There is no beating these troops, in spite of their generals. I always thought they were bad soldiers. Now I am sure of it. I had turned their right, pierced their center, and everywhere victory was mine. But they did not know how to run." Though checked at Albuera, Soult remained determined to save Badajoz. The arrival of Marmont's army created a combined French force strong enough to compel the British to abandon their siege. However, when Wellington withdrew to a strong defensive position across the Portuguese border, the French marshals declined to pursue, a testament to the growing respect they had developed for Wellington's tactical abilities and the steadfast quality of his troops. The war in Spain had reached a strategic stalemate, yet beneath the grand movements of armies, another kind of warfare was transforming the conflict's nature. Since 1808, Spanish and Portuguese civilians, along with militia forces and former soldiers, had been waging their own war against the French occupiers. This irregular warfare, characterized by ambushes and lightning raids, became known in Spanish as La Guerrilla, the Little War. Its practitioners, the guerrillas, would give their name to this style of warfare in military vocabularies worldwide. The guerrilla campaign proved remarkably effective, forcing the French to disperse significant forces to protect their supply lines and communications. Britain's Royal Navy played a crucial role in sustaining this resistance, conducting daring operations to deliver weapons, supplies, and funding to guerrilla bands operating deep behind enemy lines. This combination of conventional and irregular warfare would eventually help drive the French from the peninsula, while providing a model for resistance movements that would influence conflicts for centuries to come. The guerrilla warfare that emerged across Spain during the Peninsular War transformed what had begun as a conventional military conflict into something far more complex and devastating for the French forces. Much of Spain's rugged countryside, with its challenging terrain and isolated communities, fell under the control of various guerrilla bands, each led by charismatic leaders who would become legendary figures in Spanish history. North of Madrid, one of the most prominent guerrilla leaders was Juan Martín Díez, known to history as El Empecinado, the Stubborn One. A former soldier in the regular Spanish army, El Empecinado built a formidable force of 6,000 fighters, demonstrating how these irregular units could grow to rival the size of conventional military formations. His nickname perfectly captured the determined spirit of the Spanish resistance. In the region of Navarre, an even more remarkable leader emerged in the form of Espoz I Mina, a former peasant who developed one of the most sophisticated guerrilla operations of the entire war. Mina's organization specifically targeted the crucial Burgos-Bayonne road, a vital French supply and communication route. His tactics went beyond mere military operations. He understood the psychological aspects of warfare, famously branding Viva Mina on the foreheads of those who collaborated with the French, creating a powerful deterrent against cooperation with the occupiers. The western regions saw the rise of Julian Sanchez, known as El Charro, who led the self-styled Lanceros de Castilla. El Charro demonstrated the guerrillas' flair for symbolic resistance by wearing a captured French hussar's cap, with its eagle emblem deliberately turned upside down, a small but powerful gesture of defiance that epitomized the Spanish resistance's determination to mock and humiliate their occupiers. While these leaders became celebrated figures, the reality of guerrilla warfare was far from romantic. The conflict devolved into a cycle of brutality and revenge, with atrocities committed by both sides. French soldiers particularly dreaded capture by guerrilla forces, as torture often preceded execution. This brutal nature of the conflict meant that even small French units required significant protection. Messenger groups needed escorts of 200 or more cavalry, and even then, many didn't survive their journeys. The intercepted dispatches often found their way to Wellington's headquarters, providing crucial intelligence that helped coordinate conventional and irregular operations. The scale of French losses in Spain was staggering. 260,000 soldiers would ultimately perish in the conflict. Following the pattern of warfare in this era, disease proved far deadlier than combat, claiming 3 out of every 4 French casualties. This high disease rate was exacerbated by the guerrilla strategy of targeting supply lines, which often left French troops malnourished and more susceptible to illness. The French found themselves caught in an impossible strategic dilemma that would become a model for future insurgencies. When they dispersed their forces to combat the guerrillas, they became vulnerable to Wellington's conventional army. However, when they concentrated their forces to face Wellington, the guerrillas would quickly reclaim control of the countryside. This pattern would later be studied by military theorists as a classic example of how irregular warfare could neutralize a superior conventional force's advantages. Napoleon himself recognized the severity of the situation, referring to Spain as his bleeding ulcer. The daily toll of approximately 100 casualties steadily drained French resources and morale, creating a constant drain on the empire's military strength. This became particularly significant in 1812, as Napoleon prepared for his Russian campaign, forcing him to divide his attention and resources between two major conflicts. The effectiveness of the Spanish guerrilla campaign established a new paradigm in warfare. It demonstrated how a determined population, even without formal military training, could significantly impact a conventional military campaign by targeting vulnerabilities in supply lines, communication networks, and isolated outposts. The term guerrilla itself would enter military vocabularies worldwide, describing a style of warfare that would influence conflicts for centuries to come. The combination of Wellington's conventional forces and the guerrilla campaign created a uniquely challenging environment for the French occupation. This hybrid warfare approach would later be studied and emulated by resistance movements worldwide, demonstrating how irregular forces could effectively support and complement conventional military operations. The Spanish experience showed that successful occupation required more than just military superiority. It needed the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of the local population. The fall of Valencia in January 1812 marked a pivotal moment in the Peninsular War, though its significance would prove different than either side initially realized. The city, overcrowded with Spanish troops and desperate refugees, faced an impossible situation. General Blake, confronting the specter of mass starvation, was forced to surrender to Marshal Suchet on January 8th. The scale of the capitulation was staggering. 18,000 Spanish soldiers became prisoners, including 23 generals, while nearly 500 guns fell into French hands. For Spain, it represented one of the most devastating military defeats of the entire conflict. However, this French triumph contained the seeds of future vulnerability. To achieve this victory, Napoleon had been forced to redistribute his forces in Spain, weakening other sectors. More critically, he then withdrew 25,000 of his finest troops for his planned invasion of Russia. This decision would have far-reaching consequences, as it left French forces in Spain dangerously overextended at precisely the moment Wellington was preparing his most ambitious offensive. Wellington's intelligence network, greatly enhanced by Spanish guerrillas, kept him well informed of these French redeployments. Recognizing that the forces opposing him in western Spain had been significantly weakened, he saw an opportunity for a decisive strike before the French could consolidate their positions. His first target was Ciudad Rodrigo, a crucial fortress on the Portuguese-Spanish frontier, which he besieged on the same day Valencia fell. Understanding the importance of speed, knowing that Marshal Marmont might attempt to relieve the city, Wellington took a calculated risk. Rather than conducting a methodical siege, he ordered an assault after just 10 days. The gamble succeeded, though at a significant cost. Among the 300 British casualties was Major General Crawford, the highly respected commander of the Light Division, whose loss was deeply felt throughout the army. Without pausing to savor this victory, Wellington immediately shifted his focus south to the more formidable fortress of Badajoz. The assault, launched on the night of April 6th, demonstrated both the brutality of siege warfare and the unpredictable nature of military operations. While the main attack on the breach resulted in horrific casualties, a supposedly diversionary assault on the castle, using scaling ladders, unexpectedly succeeded, leading to the city's capture. The human cost was severe: 3,700 British casualties in the assault alone. What followed showed the darker side of military victory, as surviving troops, many traumatized by the savage fighting, went on a rampage through the city. The subsequent orgy of drinking, looting, and violence resulted in the deaths of more than 100 Spanish civilians before British officers could restore order. This episode highlighted the thin line between disciplined soldiers and unleashed fury, especially following the extreme stress of siege warfare. With these two key fortresses secured, Wellington had achieved control over the main invasion routes between Spain and Portugal. He then demonstrated his strategic acumen by dispatching General Hill, one of his most trusted subordinates, on a precise strike mission. The target was the bridge at Almaraz, a critical link in French communications between Marmont's army of Portugal and Soult's army of the south. The next viable crossing was at Toledo, 90 miles east, making this bridge's destruction a severe blow to French operational flexibility. Hill's assault on the bridge's defensive works was a masterpiece of tactical surprise and execution. Despite facing well-prepared fortifications, including forts and redoubts, his force achieved complete surprise. The successful destruction of the bridge and engineering equipment cost only 177 casualties, a remarkably small price for such a strategically significant outcome. These successes set the stage for Wellington's advance into Spain proper. His offensive was carefully coordinated with other Allied forces. Spanish regular armies and guerrilla bands launched operations to tie down French forces, while Sir Home Popham's naval squadron conducted raids along the Bay of Biscay coast, further dispersing French attention and resources. Wellington reached Salamanca in just 4 days, forcing Marmont, who was outnumbered, to withdraw behind the Douro River. However, after receiving reinforcements, Marmont recrossed the river, leading to a fascinating display of military maneuvering. For 6 days, the two armies moved in parallel, often within sight of each other, as Marmont attempted to outflank Wellington's position. The British commander matched each move, maintaining his army's strategic position while waiting for his opponent to make a mistake. That mistake came on the 7th day, July 22nd, when Marmont's belief that Wellington was an overly cautious general led him to take unnecessary risks. The morning began with French forces securing the Greater Arapil Hill, which Marmont used as his observation post. From this position, he began an ambitious flanking maneuver, convinced that Wellington would retreat rather than risk battle. This misunderstanding of his opponent's character and capabilities would prove to be a costly error, setting the stage for one of the war's most decisive engagements. The Battle of Salamanca hinged on a critical moment of misinterpretation that would transform the Peninsular War. Wellington's army was largely concealed behind hills, leaving Marmont to interpret limited visual information. When dust clouds appeared to the west, Marmont made a fateful assumption. Rather than recognizing these as signs of Wellington reinforcing his flank with the British 3rd Division and Portuguese cavalry, Marmont believed he was witnessing Wellington's baggage train beginning a retreat from Salamanca. This misreading of the situation stemmed from Marmont's fundamental misunderstanding of Wellington's character. The French marshal had convinced himself that his opponent was overly cautious and would avoid decisive battle. This prejudice would prove catastrophic for the French army. Around 2 p.m., acting on his flawed interpretation, Marmont ordered 5 infantry divisions to advance westward from their position in the woods. His intent was to cut off Wellington's supposed retreat. This movement began to create dangerous gaps in the French line. General Malcuna's 5th Division, leading the advance, engaged what they assumed was merely a British rearguard at the village of Los Arapiles. Meanwhile, General Thomier's 7th Division continued westward, further extending and exposing the French left flank. Wellington, observing this developing situation from his position, recognized an extraordinary opportunity. In a moment that demonstrated both his tactical acumen and personal leadership, he galloped 3 miles across country to the 3rd Division, outpacing many of his staff officers. Upon reaching his brother-in-law, Edward Pakenham, who commanded the division, Wellington issued characteristically clear and decisive orders: attack and drive everything before him. The ensuing assault demonstrated the effectiveness of surprise in warfare. The 3rd Division's advance remained hidden behind low hills until the final moment, achieving complete tactical surprise. Thomier's division, caught entirely unprepared, suffered devastating casualties. Thomier's himself was killed, and his division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, with half its strength killed or captured, and the remainder fleeing in disorder. At this crucial juncture, fate dealt the French another blow. Marshal Marmont was struck by a British shell and severely wounded, forcing his evacuation from the battlefield. The chain of command then suffered further disruption when his immediate successor, General Bonnet, was also wounded within the hour, leaving General Clausel to assume command in the midst of crisis. The British exploitation of their initial success demonstrated Wellington's grasp of combined arms warfare. 45 minutes after the initial assault, the British 5th Division attacked, supported by Portuguese brigades and General Le Marchand's heavy dragoons. When French troops attempted to form defensive squares against the cavalry threat, they were caught by British infantry, who delivered devastating close-range volleys before charging with bayonets. The subsequent cavalry charge by Le Marchand's dragoons completed the destruction of the French units, though Le Marchand himself fell in the attack. His brigade's achievement was remarkable: the destruction of 8 French battalions and the capture of 2 eagles, the precious standards whose loss brought great dishonor to French regiments. Wellington's battle plan unfolded as an echelon attack, with Cole's 4th Division advancing in the center. However, the battle wasn't entirely one-sided. Pack's Portuguese brigade suffered a significant repulse at the Greater Arab Hill, causing disorder in the entire division's advance. General Clausel, despite the devastation of his army's left flank, demonstrated commendable leadership by launching a counterattack against the Lesser Arab Hill, which formed the hinge of Wellington's position. Had this attack succeeded, it might have reversed the battle's outcome. However, Clinton's 6th Division, arriving with fresh troops, met the French advance with withering musket fire, forcing them back. The French army's morale finally broke, with soldiers streaming away into the protective woods behind their position. General Ferry's 3rd Division mounted a valiant rearguard action to cover the retreat, but faced impossible odds. The British 5th Division outflanked this last pocket of resistance, and Ferry fell in the fighting. Only General Foy's 1st Division managed to withdraw in good order. The battle's human cost was severe but unevenly distributed. The French suffered around 13,000 casualties, 7,000 captured and 6,000 killed or wounded, representing a devastating 25% of their force. Wellington's losses, while significant, were less than half the French total. The following day brought further French losses, when the King's German Legion cavalry achieved a rare feat by successfully charging and breaking a French infantry square, capturing another 1,000 soldiers. The strategic implications of Salamanca were immense. Wellington's victory forced King Joseph to abandon Madrid, retreating to Valencia to join Marshal Suchet. The liberation of Madrid on August 12th triggered celebrations throughout the city. The battle's impact rippled across the peninsula, compelling Marshal Soult to abandon the long-running siege of Cadiz and march east to join Joseph and Suchet. fundamentally altering the strategic situation in southern Spain. Wellington then pressed his advantage northward, driving the French from Valladolid and laying siege to Burgos Castle. Though this final move would prove overambitious, this decisive battle demonstrated Wellington's tactical brilliance and his army's growing professional capability, while exposing the vulnerabilities of the French command system when key leaders became casualties. It marked a turning point in the Peninsular War, proving that French armies could be not just defeated, but destroyed in open battle. The conclusion of Wellington's 1812 Spanish campaign revealed both the limitations and achievements of Allied military power. The siege of Burgos Castle proved particularly frustrating, as Wellington's army lacked the heavy artillery necessary for successful siege operations. The French garrison's determined resistance, combined with the gathering of powerful French armies to both north and south, created a dangerous strategic situation that threatened to trap Wellington's forces. This predicament forced Wellington to execute a difficult withdrawal. The retreat quickly transformed into an arduous forced march through autumn rains, testing the discipline and endurance of his army. The breakdown of the supply system led to a concerning deterioration in troop behavior, with many hungry soldiers resorting to looting Spanish villages for sustenance. This unfortunate development strained relations with the local population, whose support was crucial to the Allied cause. The strategic situation appeared to have come full circle when the French reoccupied Madrid on November 1st, seemingly erasing 5 months of Allied advances. However, this superficial setback masked deeper strategic gains. Wellington's offensive had compelled the French to evacuate significant portions of Spain, stretching their already thin forces even further. More importantly, it had demonstrated that French control of Spain was increasingly tenuous. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles to the east, events of even greater magnitude were unfolding. The roots of this crisis stretched back to 1807, when Napoleon and Russian Emperor Alexander had forged their alliance at Tilsit following the French victory at Friedland. Their celebrated meeting, marked by apparent friendship and mutual understanding, would prove to be the high water mark of Franco-Russian cooperation. The deterioration of this crucial alliance occurred gradually over 5 years, driven by multiple sources of tension. The creation of the Duchy of Warsaw particularly alarmed Russian leaders, who viewed it as French interference in their sphere of influence and feared it might presage the resurrection of an independent Polish state. Historically, a significant threat to Russian interests. Personal matters further strained the relationship. Napoleon's pursuit of a marriage alliance with Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna met with prolonged Russian prevarication, reflecting the Romanov family's deep reservations about such a union. Napoleon's subsequent marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria represented not just a personal slight, but a significant diplomatic reorientation. The situation worsened when Napoleon violated his Tilsit guarantees by annexing the Duchy of Oldenburg, whose ruler was closely connected to the Russian imperial family. However, the most severe strain came from economic policy. The Continental System, Napoleon's ambitious attempt to strangle British commerce through economic warfare, proved particularly damaging to Russian interests. While Alexander had agreed to participate in this blockade at Tilsit, its implementation during an economic crisis severely impacted Russian finances. The resumption of clandestine trade with Britain reflected both economic necessity and growing Russian resistance to French dominance. Napoleon's furious reaction to these violations accelerated the drift toward war. Despite the ongoing commitment of over 200,000 troops to the Spanish conflict, Napoleon began assembling an unprecedented invasion force. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered approximately 600,000 men, though French troops comprised less than half this total. The remainder represented a remarkable coalition of European states, including both willing allies and recently defeated powers now uncomfortably aligned with France. The multinational nature of this force reflected both Napoleon's power and the inherent weaknesses of his empire. While some allied contingents, particularly the Polish and German units, demonstrated reliability comparable to French formations, others brought significant liabilities. The Prussian and Austrian contingents, in particular, represented reluctant participation by states harboring deep resentment toward French dominance. Napoleon organized this massive force into 3 armies, with the main body under his direct command and subsidiary forces led by his stepson Eugène and brother Jérôme. The selection of these relatively inexperienced commanders for such crucial roles reflected both nepotism and the increasing strain on French military leadership after years of continuous warfare. The Russian response to this threat demonstrated impressive strategic acumen. Initially outnumbered 2-1, with only 220,000 troops divided between Barclay de Tolly's First Army, Bagration's Second Army, and Tormasov's Third Army, Russian diplomacy achieved crucial successes that strengthened their position. The neutralization of Swedish threats and peace with the Ottoman Empire allowed Russia to concentrate its forces against the French invasion, while securing its strategic flanks. These diplomatic achievements would prove crucial in the coming campaign, as Russia prepared to face the largest military force yet assembled in European history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of Napoleon's empire and reshape the balance of power in Europe. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon, never one for modest undertakings, began marching the largest army Europe had ever seen across the Niemen River into Russia. And when I say large, I mean it took 5 whole days just to get everyone across. Talk about traffic. Our dear emperor, bless his strategically overconfident heart, had what he thought was a brilliant plan. Attack north of the Pripet marshes, nasty bit of terrain that. Crush Barclay's army, while his brother Jérôme kept Bagration busy, then swing south for the coup de grâce. 5 weeks, he said. I've had holidays in the south of France that lasted longer. But here's the delicious irony. The sheer size of Napoleon's army actually worked against him. General Barclay, being the sensible chap he was, took one look at this approaching behemoth and thought, "Not today, Bonaparte." Even the famously aggressive Prince Bagration, usually about as cautious as a drunk at a wedding buffet, had to agree retreat was the better part of valor. The Russians, proving themselves masters of the "if we can't have it, neither can you" school of warfare, burned everything as they withdrew. Villages, crops, the lot. They even torched Vilnius's Starbucks equivalent, if you can imagine such savagery. Napoleon reached Vilnius in 4 days, only to find Barclay had done a spectacular vanishing act. Meanwhile, his brother Jérôme, proving that military genius doesn't always run in the family, completely botched his part of the plan. When Marshal Davout swung around to trap Bagration, the Russian commander had already scarpered. Poor Jérôme, utterly humiliated, slunk back to Westphalia like a contestant voted off a reality show. Now, here's where it gets properly entertaining. Napoleon, who'd organized supply depots with his usual meticulous attention to detail, discovered that Russian roads were about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Summer thunderstorms turned them into mud rivers that would make a spa treatment look positively pristine. The wagons moved slower than gossip in a small village. The Grande Armée, once as swift and deadly as a striking cobra, had transformed into something more akin to a heavily sedated elephant. Young conscripts, who'd probably never walked further than their local pub, were dropping like flies. The desertion rate was higher than a politician's expense claims. And let's talk about the horses. 250,000 of them at the start, dying at a rate of 1,000 per day. They were dropping faster than social media influencers' followers after a scandal. Without horses, the cavalry couldn't scout, the wagons couldn't move, and the whole operation began to look about as mobile as a concrete garden gnome. Then there were the Cossacks. Oh, the Cossacks. These magnificent mavericks of the Russian steppes didn't play by any rulebook Napoleon recognized. They were like wasps at a picnic, constantly buzzing around, striking when least expected, impossible to swat effectively. They made the French light cavalry look about as efficient as a chocolate fireguard. After 16 days at Vitebsk, during which I imagine Napoleon did a lot of frustrated pacing and dramatic sighing, our ambitious emperor faced a rather sobering reality. His army had shrunk faster than a wool sweater in hot water, losing 20% of its strength without fighting a single major battle. Typhus and dysentery were having a field day, proving once again that microscopic enemies can be just as deadly as the ones carrying muskets. But did this deter our determined little Corsican? Of course not. Despite having an army reduced to half its original strength, a bit like trying to run a marathon after a heavy night out, Napoleon decided to push on to Smolensk. Meanwhile, Barclay was getting more pressure than a kettle about to whistle from both Bagration and Emperor Alexander to stop retreating and fight properly. The whole situation culminated in a rather amusing episode at Inkovo, where General Platov's Cossacks gave a French cavalry division the sort of surprise you usually reserve for birthday parties, though I doubt the French found it particularly festive. The campaign was rapidly becoming a masterclass in how not to invade Russia, a lesson that another ambitious European leader would spectacularly fail to learn about 130 years later. But that's another story for another day, darlings. What we have here is the perfect recipe for disaster. Take one oversized army, add terrible roads, mix in some Russian weather, sprinkle liberally with Cossacks, and garnish with poor logistics. Serve cold, very, very cold. But we're not quite at the winter part of this tale yet, are we? Napoleon's pursuit of the Russian army reached a critical phase in August 1812, when Barclay received false intelligence suggesting that Eugene's Fourth Corps was attempting to outflank him from the north. He abandoned his planned offensive. This created an opening that Napoleon, ever the strategic opportunist, quickly seized upon. The emperor launched what would become known as the Smolensk Maneuver, a masterpiece of military deception and movement. Using Murat's cavalry as a screen to keep Barclay unaware of his true intentions, Napoleon orchestrated a bold southern flanking movement aimed at taking Smolensk and cutting off the Russian retreat route. By the evening of August 13th, his forces had reached the Dnieper River, where French engineers rapidly constructed 4 pontoon bridges. Dawn the next day saw his army crossing the river, while Marshal Davout led a second column across at Orsha. However, what could have been a decisive moment was blunted by the heroic resistance of a single Russian unit. The 27th Division conducted a fighting retreat from Krasny that bought precious time for Bagration to reinforce Smolensk's garrison. The opportunity for a surprise assault on the city slipped away. Napoleon, in an uncharacteristic display of complacency, even halted his army to hold a parade celebrating his 43rd birthday. When the attack on Smolensk finally commenced,